Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week is the very strange story of David Watt and the murder of Ann Isabella Beaty, which took place in the Rosehill area of Howdon in 1906. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. David Watt was born in Scotland in around 1869 to parents Alexander and Catherine, and he was one of at least 8 children. The family moved to Liverpool in the mid-1800s, and in 1881 David can be found in the Liverpool Industrial School. For anyone interested, from what I have read, industrial schools were set up for children under the age of 14 who were homeless, possibly begging and in danger of committing crimes. However, there is no clear evidence of this for David, as his family was still alive at the time and still living in the area, but he was there for a reason, and this could have been that he was out of control and his parents could no longer cope with him and his behaviour. However, this is something that cannot be confirmed. The children in the school, it was hoped, would be taught a trade which would help them to lead a better life than they had previously done. No details are known as to when David first moved to the northeast, but he married Isabella Beaty, the daughter of Ann Isabella Beaty, in around 1898 in Tynemouth, and by 1901 the couple could be found living in Willington Quay with their son David, Isabella's mother Ann, and a niece by the name of Dora Brown. The family would later move to Ord Avenue in Howdon, and David worked at the Wallsend Slipway as a labourer. Ann Isabella Beaty was born in around 1828 in North Shields. Her parents are unknown. At the time of the crime she was a widow, but had previously been married to John Beaty, who had been a builder, and the couple had had at least 5 children together. John had died in around 1894, and Anne had later moved into the home of her daughter Isabella and her husband David. All was quiet in the home of the Watts family in Ord Avenue on the night of April the 19th, 1906. The family all retired to bed as usual at around 10 p.m. Anne had a room of her own at the back of the house, and Dora slept in the same room as David, Isabella and their son. David left for work at the Wallsend Slipway the next morning at around 5:30 a.m. Dora got up at around 7 a.m. and went into the back room where Anne, who was also her grandmother, was sleeping. At this point she did not seem to notice anything unusual, and her grandmother appeared to be sleeping. But a short time later she heard what sounded like groaning coming from the room, and she went back in, only to find Anne lying on her bed with a severe wound to her head and her face covered in blood. She shouted for Isabella and also called for some of the neighbours. They washed the blood from Anne's face, but did not seem to do much more, as it was not until around 10 a.m. that the doctor was finally sent for. Dr. Craig of Rosehill Terrace took great care of Ann Beaty, but it seems there was nothing that could be done for her, and she died on Saturday, April the 21st. And it was then that the police were notified of her death and about the strange wound on her head. P.C. Purvis arrived at the house to find Anne still lying in her bed. He was aware that she was already dead and noted the wound to her head. He asked David, Isabella and Dora how she came to be injured, but they did not give any reply. And he then took David, Isabella and Dora to Wallsend Police Station, where he charged all 3 on suspicion of causing the death of Ann Beaty. And although the home was searched, it seems nothing was found that could have caused the wound to Anne's head. Prior to the inquest, a special court hearing was held at Wallsend. This may have been held at the Wallsend Cafe, which was often used for court hearings prior to the town hall being built, which, when built, also had a courtroom and police cells. All 3 prisoners attended the hearing, and Inspector Marshall requested that Dora was discharged, as he stated there was no evidence against her, and this was granted. However, he stated that the charges against David and Isabella Watts at that time still stood. No evidence was given as inquiries were still ongoing, and both David and Isabella were sent to Newcastle Prison on remand until the inquest. The inquest, which had already previously been adjourned, was reopened at the council chambers in Willington Quay at the end of April. No details were given as to the identification of the body, which is normally the case. However, she may have been identified by the doctor who had been treating her at home, so family identification was not felt necessary in this case. Dora Brown, who was around 13 years old, said Ann Beaty was her grandmother, and she lived with her and her aunt and uncle at Ord Avenue in Rosehill in Howdon. She said she had not heard any arguments the night before the crime, and they had all gone to bed as normal. In the morning she had gone into Anne's room looking for a sewing pin. She had found one and left, but almost immediately she heard a strange sound from the room and went back inside. It was then that she noticed Anne was bleeding badly from a wound to her head and also had black and swollen eyes. She said Anne had not replied when she had spoken to her, so she had called her Aunt Isabel to come into the room. She had then gone to fetch two of the neighbours to help her aunt with her grandmother. Later that morning she said she had taken her Uncle David his breakfast at the Wallsend slipway. She had told him that Anne was unwell. He replied that it was a pity he had not been at home when she had been found. She later went back with his lunch, this time telling David that the doctor said that Anne was dying. He said he had not known she was so ill or he would have returned home earlier. When asked, she said that David and Anne often argued, and that David had threatened to throw Anne out of the house. She admitted that the arguments had often been about her. The coroner asked had these arguments been because her grandmother had found David behaving inappropriately towards her, and Dora said yes, it was true, and the last time had been 2 years ago, when her grandmother had found her, Dora, struggling with David and crying. She was then asked if she had told her grandmother not to tell her aunt, and she said yes she had, but her aunt already knew. She said 2 weeks prior to the murder, David Watts had been making strange remarks, stating that he could not stand the sight of that woman, meaning her grandmother. Anne Casson of Ord Avenue said she was called to the house on the morning of April the 20th and found Ann Beaty unconscious in bed. She said Isabella Watt was in the room, and when asked, she said that she thought Anne had got out of bed and fallen. She said she then dressed the wound on Anne's head, and later she went to fetch Dr. Craig. Mary Wilson, who also lived in Ord Avenue, said she had been called to the house on April the 20th as well. She confirmed what Anne Casson had said earlier, also adding that the room did not show any signs of a disturbance, and she did not see any signs of blood on the floor or around the room. Dr. Craig of Rosehill Terrace said he had been called to the house on the Friday morning. He had found Anne lying in bed unconscious. She had a star-shaped wound on the right side of her forehead which was bleeding badly. Her face was covered with blood, and her eyes were also black and swollen. He said he had taken care of her until she died the following day. He had also performed the post-mortem, and it was his professional opinion that she had died due to the wound to her forehead which had caused bleeding to the brain. He believed the wound had been caused by a blunt, round-ended object. When asked, he said that Ann Beaty could not have caused the damage herself. If she had fallen and hit her head, she would not have been able to get back into the bed by herself. It was his opinion that the wound had been inflicted by someone else. At this point, the coroner said the inquest must be adjourned again to allow the police to gather more evidence, and before the inquest was resumed, another special court hearing was held at Wallsend, where Inspector Marshall said he had no evidence against Isabella Watt, and he asked for her to be discharged, and the bench agreed to this, and Isabella was then free to leave. The inquest resumed on May the 25th, 1906, again at the council chambers in Willington Quay. By now, only David Watt was still on the charge of wilful murder. He was asked if Isabella, his wife, would be given evidence, however she did not seem to want to do so. The coroner said she could not be made to give evidence if she did not wish to do so. Dora Brown was recalled, and it was here that the strange story of the hammer was first discussed. She said that she had first seen the hammer just the week before. This was the week before May the 25th. She then appeared to hesitate, and Inspector Marshall said he believed that if she had not actually been threatened, she had at the very least been told not to give evidence against her uncle. The coroner replied by telling Dora that she must not worry about that and must tell him all she knew. The inspector would deal with anyone who threatened her. Dora then continued by saying her aunt had shown her the hammer and said she had found it in the kitchen. She had said, "Look what I have found, and it has blood and hair on it." Dora said she believed the hairs to be her grandmother's. Her aunt then sent for a neighbour, a Mrs. Kersop, who on seeing the hammer was told by Isabella that Dora had found it. Dora said she had told Mrs. Kersop that she had not been the one to find it. Mrs. Kersop had then said that they must send for the police, and Dora also said that she had not seen the hammer where her aunt had found it. She had looked in that same place only recently, and there'd been no hammer there then. Dora also said that her uncle had recently told her that he would have to get rid of her grandmother somehow, but he did not say how. Mrs. Kersop said she had been called to the house by Dora Brown on the night the hammer was found. She said Isabella had said to her, "What do you think of this?" She had looked at the hammer and thought it had blood and hair on it, but she could not be sure. She said Isabella Watt had told her that Dora had found it, but Dora had told her she had not. P.C. Purvis said he was stationed at Rosehill, and he had originally charged Dora Brown and Isabella and David Watt with the murder of Ann Beaty. However, since then, Dora and Isabella had been discharged. He was called again to the house by Dora Brown when the hammer had been found. He had examined the hammer and did believe that it had blood and hair upon it. It seemed unclear where it had come from and how it had not been found earlier. However, the hammer was said to belong to David and was used in his job, so it may well have been in his work bag, as I did not find any evidence to suggest his work tools or bag had been searched after the murder had taken place. There was no further evidence given after this, and the coroner said this was a very strange and tragic case. It was for the jury to decide if they felt that David had committed the crime. Had he attacked her with the hammer produced or some other item? He stated that the evidence of his threats against Ann Beaty, as given by Dora, would mean this was a case of murder or nothing. The jury at the inquest very quickly returned a verdict of wilful murder against David Watt, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Ann Beaty, but based on where she lived, I would assume she would have been buried in Churchbank Cemetery, which at the time was the main and only cemetery in Wallsend and Howdon area. The trial took place in July of 1906, and David Watt pleaded not guilty to the charge. The main witness was Dora Brown, and her evidence, already covered earlier, had not changed since the inquest. The only different things that were said were as follows. Dr. Bolam of the Durham College of Medicine in Newcastle said he had examined the hammer and could not be sure that there was any blood on it. He did, however, find hair on it, both brown and grey, which he believed to be human hair. He also found fibres of material, some woolen and some cotton, and it had been suggested that Ann Beaty had had her shawl over her head at the time the wounds had been inflicted. Dr. Bolam said he had also examined the clothing belonging to David Watt and had not been able to find any traces of blood on them. P.C. Purvis gave similar evidence to that at the inquest, only adding that after her release, Isabella had visited David at the court before his hearing. He said he had cautioned her that he would be able to hear anything that was said. He said she had not spoken after this, as David had told her to do as your solicitor tells you, keep your mouth shut, go home and do not speak to the neighbours. The prosecution stated that this was a strange case. The evidence suggested that Ann Beaty was killed by a blow from a hammer that had been inflicted sometime in the early hours of Friday morning. The doctor had given evidence to suggest that the blow to the head of Ann Beaty had indeed caused her death and could not have been caused by a fall. He went on to say that only Dora Brown had been able to give evidence of what had happened in that house, and she knew very little. He added that when Dora had taken food to the Wall's End slipway for her uncle and told him of her grandmother's condition, he had stated that he had not been in her room that morning, which he felt was a strange thing for him to say. No weapon had been found, he said, at the time of Ann's death, but some time later a hammer was found with hair on it that matched Ann's. It was believed this hammer belonged to David, and that he and Ann were not on good terms, frequently arguing. He asked the jury to consider whether or not there was indeed a motive for David to have committed the murder to rid himself of a woman he disliked. At this point, it would be usual for the defence to call their witnesses. However, in a strange twist in the tale, the magistrate spoke of the evidence in this case being purely circumstantial. There was no evidence of blood on the clothes of David Watt, and no evidence that he had been in the bedroom of Ann Beaty that morning, and no witnesses to suggest otherwise. And for murder, they said, the evidence must be overwhelming, and there was not sufficient for the jury to safely find David Watt guilty of murder. It would seem they had no desire to reduce the case to manslaughter, as the jury were then advised to find the prisoner not guilty, which they did without question, and David Watt was free to return to his home and family. David would later move back to Liverpool with his son, as he could be found living there in 1911. David was by then a widow. However, I was unable to find any details of when Isabella died. Dora also went with the family to Liverpool. However, she was now known as his daughter and appeared to have changed her name to Watt. David's son, also called David, was killed in action during World War I and is buried in London. Dora married a man by the name of John Jones, and she moved to the United States in 1936, and she died in New York in 1966. However, her ashes were later returned to the UK and are buried in Anfield Cemetery in Liverpool. Her husband died in New York in 1967, and his ashes are also buried in Anfield Cemetery. David himself also went to America sometime between 1926 and 1930, and he died there in September of 1930. His burial location is unknown. This was a truly confusing story. Where did the hammer come from? Did Isabella place it there in the hope of incriminating her husband? Was she actually afraid of him? Had David previously hidden it, or was it not the murder weapon at all? I can't honestly say that I feel David was not guilty. He did seem to have a dislike for Ann Beaty, had talked of getting rid of her, and he certainly had reason to want her out of the house if his behaviour towards Dora was true. Did he kill her before he went to work that morning? Well, I guess it is possible, but it seems the evidence was not strong enough to prove this without a doubt. And I also found it very odd that Dora would speak of her uncle's improper behaviour towards her, and then continue to live with him, even moving to Liverpool with him, and staying there until her marriage. But what do you think? Was David guilty? Had he been mistreating Dora? Should he have been found guilty of murder, or was there not enough evidence to prove his guilt? Do you think Anne may have simply fallen and somehow been able to get back into her bed? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again very soon.